I'm working off of a PowerPoint presentation, which I don't normally do, but in this case, I think it makes sense. So what you're going to see is a PowerPoint presentation with some narration. I'm doing this late at night, so bear with me as I flip through my different sources. So here's the deal. Um, we've been talking about the emergence of Crusader states in the aftermath of the First Crusade. And we've done that through the lens of the women who ruled those Crusader states. What I want to do now is to shift focus to another periphery of Europe, northwestern France and England. And of course, we spent time in England before, but I think it's worthwhile to take a look here because here again, you're going to see women playing significant roles in the history and development of those nations. So in northwestern Europe, the nascent states that will become France and England um, show the emergence of a different generation struggle centered on the person of the Queen of France and later Queen of England, Eleanor of Aquitaine. It's going to take us a while, a couple of hundred years before we get there, but we'll move on and see what we can do. Eleanor is an interesting woman in part because she represents a trend in English history, the ruling queen, something that we'll see even up to our present day with Queen Elizabeth II. This trend has its roots in England after the conquest by the Normans under William of Normandy, which of course we've talked about already. One of the first things William does in order to is order to the creation of what's called the Domesday Book, which is essentially a list of who owns all the land in England and how much that land is worth. It's an enormous compilation. It takes years, but it serves as one of the great demographic surveys of high Middle Ages Europe. William divides his time between his original Duchy of Normandy and England, and his sons follow this pattern after him. They're going to be hopping back and forth across the English Channel quite a lot. The eldest of William's sons, Robert Curthose, and Curthose means essentially short socks, goes off on the First Crusade. He comes back eventually, but he's so much in debt because the process of going on the First Crusade was expensive that he essentially has to hawk the Duchy of Normandy off to his younger brother, who stayed at home and collected money. It actually took the form of a mortgage to his younger brother Henry in order to pay for those expenses. The second of William's sons is William II, called Rufus, because he had red hair. He ends up being King of England, and he reigns for a number of years and ends up being killed in a tragic hunting accident. There have been people who suggested this was actually a conspiracy and that he was murdered. You can see there the arrow sticking out of him in the center of the picture. The third son is the one most like his dad. That's Henry I. Henry is kind of like the brilliant third son in fairy tales because he makes an effort to unite Normans and English by marrying a princess from the line of Old English kings. Now, her dad was King of Scotland, so she's known as Matilda of Scotland. But as far as most of the Anglo-Saxons in England are concerned, she is actually the grandchild of Edward Confessor. Henry establishes a cross-channel empire by uniting Normandy and England under one rule. And by this time, his next oldest brother was dead, that's William, and his oldest brother had gotten so far into debt that he couldn't rule anymore. He essentially lost control of the duchy altogether. So Henry is in good shape. When William died, he actually learned of the news early on, and yes, there are some people who believe that he had his brother murdered, but there's no hard evidence for that. But as soon as Henry learned that William had died, he headed off toward Winchester. It's a town in the center of southern England. And the important thing about Winchester is not only was it the capital of England under the last Old English kings, it was also the place where all the money was kept, where the treasury was kept. And Henry seized control of the treasury before his eldest brother Robert could get a hold of it, and therefore managed not only to gain control of England, but also to wrest eventually control of Normandy away from Robert. So Henry takes over Normandy, and this means that Henry now has a divided set of responsibilities. In other words, he has to spend part of his time ruling Normandy, he has to spend part of his time ruling England, and the end result is that he has a kind of, well, a peripatetic lifestyle. He has to run back and forth between the two, sometimes spending months in one or the other. This becomes especially tricky when he gets involved in wars against his neighbors on the continent, because then he's away from England and he's not doing any active ruling. In those cases, during the first 17 or 18 years of his rule, from 1100 to about 1118, Henry's wife, Matilda of Scotland, becomes his regent. In other words, she effectively runs the country in his absence. And this is considered by the Saxon population of England as essentially a continuation of the Old English king's rule. So everybody is primed to be happy under whenever Henry's out of the country. And then Henry's son and namesake and heir is sailing from the continent to England in bad weather, and his ship gets wrecked. It's called the White Ship, and it ends up being wrecked off the coast of Normandy, and Henry the young king's body is thrown up on land. And this absolutely flattens his dad. By this time, his wife is dead. He's remarried, but Henry was his only heir. And besides him, all he really has to fall back on is his daughter, Matilda. So he gets assurances from his nobles that they will recognize his daughter Matilda, the widow of the Holy Roman Emperor, as next ruler of England. Henry had not wasted any time in getting Matilda remarried once she returned to England, in hopes of cementing a new political alliance with Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, Normandy's neighbor to the south. Geoffrey and Matilda didn't get along, partly because at the time they were married, she was 25 and he was 13, but they did have a son named Henry after his grandfather. Before we get to that, however, we need to talk a little bit about what happened to Matilda. And how she ended up marrying the Holy Roman Emperor. Well, the deal was, as with most of these relationships, this was a marriage of politics. And the emperor was looking for ways of securing alliances. And one of the ways was to marry the daughter of the King of England. And he was 24 at the time of the marriage. Matilda was 8. So basically, the marriage was not consummated until she reached the age of 12, by which time she was essentially open to consent. But the marriage did not last very long. He died at the age of 38. She was 23, a widow, and basically was ready to return to England. And the key was basically that she had um, responsibilities in the empire that allowed her to practice kind of the sort of things that her father would expect of her in when she returns to England. And her marriage to Geoffrey of Anjou, also called Geoffrey Plantagenet, at least in part because he'd gotten a reputation as a bit of a jokester. And at one point, when somebody asked him basically, what is it that you're going to carry as the symbol of your house, he reached down, pulled out a piece of what's called broom straw. It's a common weed, and stuck it in his hat. So, and because that was called the planta genesta, he became known by the nickname Plantagenet, and that nickname will go on to be applied to the line of kings that he and Matilda and their son Henry II start. So all this is part and parcel of being a ruling woman at this time. Well, Henry had basically secured the consent of the nobility of England to Matilda's accession to the throne. She was talented, she was young, she had a son to carry on after her, all very important things in the succession. She was also someone that the English felt was kind of tainted by continental influences. The English were parochial then as now. And the end result was that they turned to her cousin, Stephen of Blois. Blois is part of France. And nominated him as King of England. This is kind of interesting because neither of them, well, Matilda is the king's child. She's a woman, obviously, but she has a son, and theoretically they could have taken the son as their next king and made her regent. But instead they turned to this adult man who was a proven warrior. And in that, that's very reminiscent of Anglo-Saxon uh, ways of succession, in which the king has to be acclaimed or elected, rather than automatically taken in, even if he's a minor, simply because of his family lineage. So that's a little significant there. This in turn leads to a civil war that basically tears the country apart for years. Um, Matilda jumping back and forth across the channel, Stephen basically winning control of certain areas and losing control of others. It's all a real mess. Sometimes she received support from people who were supporters of her father, like the bishops of the realm. Sometimes she did not. And the end result was basically that over time, Stephen and Matilda came to a kind of an impasse. Stephen was king by the selection of the realm. Matilda was queen, ruling queen by right, and they simply could not come to a real settlement. This went on for years. By 1152, Stephen was over 60, so he was old for that time. He had a son called Eustace, But Eustace couldn't find any support from any of the nobility or from the church. And basically, all that he could do was hope for things to turn his way, and that didn't happen. Eustace died suddenly in August 1153 at the age of 24. So the end result was that a few months later, Stephen came face to face with his cousin Henry, Matilda's son, at Winchester. And Henry basically allowed Stephen to reign for the rest of his life, which was going to be fairly short. And Henry would in turn accede to the throne upon Stephen's death. He apparently had some kind of an aneurysm later the following year, and he died within a few hours. Matilda had in fact won, but she'd won not in her name, but in her son's name. One of the books that deals with this most closely is by Helen Castor. It's called She-Wolves, The Women Who Ruled England Before Elizabeth. And she says, at the time of Stephen's death and Henry's accession, Matilda was in Normandy, not in England, and the king was her son, not her husband. But she acted as counselor, confidant, and royal deputy when Henry was absent, as he often was, on his constant travels around his vast dominions. Like her mother, she became increasingly preoccupied with spiritual concerns under the guidance of the monks alongside whom she lived, but she did not retreat from the world. Her son's trust in her judgment and the authority she exercised on his behalf are unmistakable. If you do not do this, declared one royal mandate dispatched from England to the justices of Normandy in the later 1150s, let my lady and mother the empress see that it is done. So as we can see, Stephen will be able to finish his reign as king as long as Matilda's son is his heir. And of course, Stephen dies soon and Henry II ascends to the throne. Henry II is actually one of the most activist kings in English history, along with Edward I and maybe Charles II. Henry comes in, takes a look at what's going on in England, and says essentially, wait a minute, there's a whole bunch of things going on here that didn't happen in my grandfather's time. Why is this happening? And so what he develops is a series of ways of communication that ask people to answer before the king for their actions. His primary concern was with the administration of justice in local feudal courts. He wanted one set of laws all across England. This would do two things. Number one, it would simplify the process of justice, which Henry was very interested in. That's one of the duties of a king. But it also would how to put this, bring money into the royal court because justice doesn't come free. So Henry creates a system of writs, basically legal instructions, issued by his writing office or chancery that allow ordinary people access to royal justice. And this is different. This meant that you didn't have to suffer through the vagaries of feudal courts. You could go right to the king, and the king's justice operated through a jury system rather than through a panel or a set of plaintiffs who might not listen to your side of the story. There are a bunch of different writs that Henry introduces. There are a bunch that are introduced by his great grandson, Edward I, but one of them is a writ of novel disseisin, and that allowed someone who'd had his lands illegally taken from him um, to try to get them back. In other words, basically, if he was illegally deprived of his lands, which is what, or disseized. Remember when we were talking about feudal society, we talked about someone is seized of the fief that the king gives him. Novel disseisin means that he has been disseized. In other words, his lands have been taken from him. And novel means essentially that it is a recent and extra legal process. So this is basically a command that you get justice in the king's courts. A writ of mort d'ancestor allowed someone who was supposed to inherit land but didn't get it because someone else took it a means to claim their rightful inheritance. And of course, mort, death, d'ancestor of your father or your ancestors. So if on those occasions you find your lands have been taken away, this was a writ you could ask the king for, and it would instruct people on how they could get justice. So basically, Henry begins undoing the process of undoing all the abuses of the barons of England. Here's the deal. That's kind of a legacy of Edward the First. Edward's process here has been, I'm sorry, I said Edward, William the First. William essentially came in as, well, as a thief. And the people that followed him were promised lands that they had to take away from other people. They kept on doing that even after William was king. He tried to stop it on occasion, but neither he nor his sons nor Matilda or Stephen were really able to put a stop to the practice. And it wasn't until um, Henry II began to change these writs and establish the precedence of royal justice over local courts that you begin to see these abuses begin to fade. Henry is still relatively young. One of the things that he has to do is to go to the King of France in order to take possession of Normandy. Remember, Normandy is not an independent country, it's a duchy. That means that the Duke of Normandy owes feudal service to the King of France, which means essentially that the King of England is the King of France's vassal. And that's particularly tricky because how can you be both a king and a vassal at the same time? Henry deals with this by essentially uh, setting the Duchy of Normandy aside. And as soon as one of his sons is old enough, he doesn't do that with Normandy, but with other duchies of which he becomes Duke uh, through marriage and through inheritance and sometimes through sheer theft, he sets up things so that his sons take over. Now he keeps a tight rein on all his sons, but he is in a lot of ways doing this as a means to avoid the idea of the King of England having to swear fealty to the King of France. In the process of going to France to take possession of Normandy, he meets the king's new wife and young queen, whose name is Eleanor. That's Eleanor of Aquitaine, where we started this particular lecture. Eleanor is a little older than Henry, maybe 3 or 4 years, but and she sees this kid coming in who is just as much a king as her much older husband. And the two of them basically do not play around. And they take off. Eleanor asks for an annulment for her marriage to the King of France. She gets it. She immediately turns around and marries Henry. And this is important less for what the King of France thought of Eleanor and more for what it says in terms of understanding the uh, feudal relationships that happen here. Eleanor's dad had been the Duke of Aquitaine. Eleanor was his heir, so she is the acting Duchess of Aquitaine. And Aquitaine is that big pink area that you see there on the map in the southwest. It's a honking amount of France, more France than the King of France controls. And now it belongs to the wife of the King of England. By marrying Eleanor, Henry has control of northern France in the form of Normandy and a lot of influence in Aquitaine throughout the rest of, well, most of the rest of France. Through a series of other marriages, he also has influences in Brittany, that's the far west, northwest part of France, and of course Anjou, because he's the son of the Count of Anjou, and um, a few other areas of France. So he's in effect putting together a cross-channel empire that's a lot bigger than the one that his grandfather had controlled. It's important to note that Eleanor doesn't give Henry full authority. She is the ruler of Aquitaine, and she guards that right zealously. Eleanor and Henry go on to have 5 sons. William the Count of Poitiers, who died at the age of 3. Henry, called the Young King. Richard, called Lionheart, who's going to be Richard I. Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, who dies really fairly young, but leaves behind a young son named Arthur, who for a while is Richard's heir. And finally, the youngest son, John, called John Lackland, because essentially all the chroniclers think that he's a waste of breath. After 15 years or so, Eleanor and Henry, both really strong personalities, begin to resent each other. The result was that Eleanor went back to Aquitaine with her son Richard, who was her favorite. Henry was not happy about this. He thought that Eleanor and Richard were plotting against him, and yes, they were. And eventually he took responsibility for Aquitaine away from them both and had Eleanor shut up in a nunnery. Henry did not see this as a problem as long as they didn't cause any trouble. But the deal was that Eleanor stayed there until Henry died, even though she was slightly older than him. And then she kind of came out and became Richard's second in command. She ran things for her son when he was off doing things like running off on the Third Crusade or campaigning in Normandy against some of his vassals who were being uppity or doing some other things. Richard also had a wife whose name I believe was Berengaria, and she played an important role in Richard's reign, but not the important role of delivering him a son and heir. And when Richard died, his brother John took up the reins of government. And that's going to change English history even further. But that, I think, is going to have to wait until we get back from spring break. I see that this is run for about half an hour. I think that's going to be about long enough. And let me wish you a happy break, and we'll see you next week.